Bernard, what's up, man? We are here back on Franchise Talk to talk about Star Wars.
Yeah, Star Wars is what we were talking about. So, how you been, man?
Pretty good, pretty good. I'm excited. I haven't started the Acolyte yet, so looking forward to that. And I've been meaning actually to do a rewatch. We'll start with the Phantom Menace, and I kind of been meaning to do a rewatch of the prequels, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's where we'll start and talk about how Star Wars is built. uh the storytelling of it, how it's really like this epic tragedy, this space tragedy, space opera, and operas are typically tragedies. And that's kind of part of the franchise and part of the genre, or the genre that is Star Wars itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would at this point almost call Star Wars a genre unto itself, right? Like it took from so many things and blended them in a way that it's incredible. It's both so unique and so generic, right? Like
Right.
it can like people can easily copy it. It has happened. Um, but also they none of them ever seem to get that like specific blend of like genres and even like visual style that
Right.
make Star Wars have become what it is.
Yeah, because it's not just like you said, it's a combination of things. So there's sci-fi, but it's not just sci-fi like the way Star Trek is, or some other things where it really deals with like the technology aspect. It's there, but it's like kind of a small part. And then it's um fantasy, space fantasy, but it doesn't really have like the mythology that fantasy has in terms of like dragons. You know what I mean? Like there could be space dragons, or there's
Yeah.
obviously different kind of creatures, but they're all kind of homebound. And there's not, but it has just enough of that with Jedi and history and there's the mythology built in there. And then it's very melodramatic too.
Super.
And really the music sells that. Whenever two people are having a conversation, it really gets into violins and like swooning.
Swelling core,
Yeah,
yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. It does a fantastic job of mixing other genres. And then it's so big. It's so big. Like there's no property bigger. And when you're that large, kind of are a genre onto yourself. People are copying you, and you
Yeah.
create your own tropes. Like we talked about the fashion before, or just the production design, costume and makeup. And it's like you can't do another space opera because anything you do is copying Star Wars.
For sure. It's so iconic.
You have like the Jedi that are like, oh, the dusty, weary travelers. And you have the high tech with the different stormtroopers in the Empire. Then you have like the peasants, and then you have like royalty. You have every style of garb. You
Oh,
know?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Like you got the bounty hunters, which are like Western cowboys. You got the smugglers like Han Solo, who are basically like 1930s gangsters, you know what I mean? Like it's got everything you can imagine.
I guess the only thing that's missing from a fashion standpoint, there's like nothing modern. Like they don't wear suits, like a shirt and tie.
Yeah.
And
It
nobody's wearing like sports jerseys, sagging pants. They don't have that
n-
2000s aesthetic.
Nobody does have sports jerseys, and that's really
Star Wars.
striking me as something that is a real missing element in
Yeah, like
Star Wars, man.
some soccer equivalent jerseys. What sport do they play in Star Wars?
Well, there's pod racing, I know that.
Pod racing, yeah, yeah. See, so they could have like race car
Yeah,
style garb, but they don't. That's the only thing they're missing.
yeah, for sure. But it's funny, like you talked about Phantom Menace, and just since I mentioned pod racing, I recently saw it because it's the 25th anniversary, so back in I think into March, early April, uh,
So
or
that was
no,
wait,
mid-April, yeah,
25th. So it's
99.
that's when Phantom Menace came out.
Yeah, it came
Wow.
out like a month
Oh,
after Matrix.
they re-released. the original three a couple years before the prequels, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. So they re 97 in
right,
1997 they re-released the original three
right.
remastered. Yeah.
That's when I saw them in theaters.
Yeah, that was
Uh,
my first time in theaters.
yeah. So Phantom Menace came out in '99, the greatest movie year in history,
Which
as we know.
definitely
Just
it
bangers,
bangers all around.
bangers all around, in every genre at every level. Indie,
Yeah, 99 was
classic.
a banner year for film for sure.
And what was that experience like for you? What did you take away this time? This is part of the reason we're doing this episode.
Right. We were kind of talking about this. So I thought it was really interesting, right? Because, I saw it opening weekend 99. I would have been 16 years old. I was already a Star Wars fan, and the 97 re releases certainly made me more so of that theater experience. And I didn't, hmm?
Definitely.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I didn't really enjoy it at the time. You know what I mean? I
Right.
remember leaving that theater disappointed, and not necessarily because it didn't have this character or that character, but I was 16. I was just starting to consider myself like a film fan, and I was like, no, this is a poorly made movie, and I don't like it, and that's a bummer. um,
And that's how that was kind of a consensus or something around that. And I think now when we look back, these movies were somewhat ahead of their time.
mm-hmm,
Just the prequel idea, I think, threw people off because I don't think that this was the first prequel necessarily. I don't have that knowledge, but whether it was or not, people weren't used to prequels yet. And with
yeah,
prequels,
definitely.
you have to pull back the world a bit, you know?
Hmm.
So you go into it wanting to see a lot of Jedi stuff, but they have to explain how the Jedi got to where we were.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
in the prequels, there's a Jedi Council and everything. There are more Jedi's and more established, but they can't be where they are by New Hope yet. You know what I mean? Like there has
Right.
to be something's pulled back in either the lore or their ability and just how they're demonstrated, even though their presence was good. But it's like, you have to explain how things got to a point and you have to tear down everything that was
Yeah.
built up.
Yeah, that's such a great point because it struck me how like so many of the things that we think about like as just being quintessentially Star Wars weren't really that until the prequels. Like like the Jedi robes, that was just Ben Kenobi what he was wearing in the desert.
Right. Just one, yeah,
Just one dude. But when they made Phantom Menace, no, now that's officially like a Jedi robe, or you know, the Emperor Palpatine, like they said his name for the first time in like Phantom Menace. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
so like just thinking about like, wow, this was still really early on because there's been so much since. And me personally as a fan, like that's mostly a good thing. But it was like really interesting to sit back like at the age of 41, having lived some life and also having like seen all the Star Wars that has come in between, to really look at that movie and view it in a whole new light.
yeah. It was also kind of conceptually confusing, I
Mm,
think, because you had to have the empire and build it, or you had to have like um the world before and destroy it. So we started with an old world.
mhm.
But with Star Wars, we never saw that at all, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there were just some concepts that were maybe it was introducing to us that now we're used to, and we can look back and kind of appreciate it more, even understand what he was trying to do, or they were trying to do, even maybe if it wasn't that successful in the movie, but we see what it was trying to do. And I also think that there's always revisionist history, but the way people feel about the latest trilogy, I think also affects people having more nostalgia and reverence for the prequels. And it's so
Yeah, I
funny to
think
have to
that's
talk
true.
about them like that. You can say the originals, the prequels, and the latest
Sequels.
trilogy, the sequels. Yeah, I wonder what the
Yeah.
next ones will be called.
I've also heard the sequel's called the Nequels because they're the new sequels or whatever,
It works.
which is terrible. Um,
But what about the tragedy?
yeah, so I mean, I think definitely like more recent Star Wars has leaned into kind of more of the tragic elements. I mean, if you saw the Ahsoka show, that definitely has like a kind of a down ending, a sadder ending. You know, I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of the shows that have happened, Obi-Wan and all of these, that really have like some really sad, tragic moments, especially as they're like expanding on like the story of like Anakin slash Darth Vader that we maybe didn't see in that original trilogy.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and it,
But
and,
it's
and
all
it's
about like sacrifice, right?
yeah, I don't even it's I think it's definitely about the willingness to sacrifice on the like heroic end.
Yeah.
And I think on the maybe the villainous end, on Anakin's end, which is definitely the most tragic story within it, I don't even know if it's about sacrifice. I think it's just about it's about making bad choices and thinking they're sacrifices. Like he was like really
Mhm.
misled. Like, you know, he felt it was a sacrifice to kill to kill the like Jedi children because that would help him get more power to save his wife.
Right.
Like that was not a sacrifice. That was a bad decision.
That was
You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
And I feel like he's got a few of those, and it really does become a story of like this really lost young man. And it was interesting to like watch this movie when he is a kid and kind of see like some of the things that are sprinkled in there that are kind of like foreshadowing, just even like the kind of chaotic upbringing that he'll have that'll shape this
yeah,
guy. But yeah, after watching it and kind of seeing, even as goofy as Phantom Menace can be, how much kind of inborn tragedy there is in there. Like finding this guy who's like a father figure in Qui-Gon and then having him get killed, and like Obi-Wan not really knowing what to do at the end, except now he's got this young kid who he's got to raise,
yeah.
and like all of that stuff. And it's like it really made me think, you know, maybe the franchise rules, we were one a previous episode we were talking about franchise rules, and I was like, maybe the franchise rule for Star Wars is actually the tragedy. We think sometimes it's the laser guns and the space shootouts and all of that stuff, but a lot of sci-fi franchises do that stuff, but
Um,
not a lot of them do like this kind of like operatic, melodramatic tragedy that Star Wars
like
does.
melodramatic tragedy. I think that rings true with what you said. Like making bad decisions leads to bad consequences,
Yeah.
or rather than it being about sacrifice, because it makes me think with the equals,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's kind of an element that's missing. A lot of the
Mm-hmm.
tragedy in that, like off screen or assumed, um, or it's just the fact of us watching the original people die,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but there's not this great tragedy. Even with Kylo, tragedies in the past
Mm-hmm.
when he killed those people. I guess, he was responsible for his parents' death in here, but that happens like in the first movie and in the second movie. Like it's
Yeah.
right away. There's no build up to it.
Yeah. He's
And
already on his path.
when he destroys Luke's training village or whatever, we never see we only see him and Luke in a flashback in when he's sleeping and wakes up or whatever. We don't see him training with these kids and turning on them. Like maybe that should have been the first
Mm-hmm.
movie so we can kind of care about what happens to him. If the whole Star Wars thing is following for these 9 movies is following the Skywalker line, the tragedy of the Skywalker line.
Yeah. And that was a little jumbled in those movies too. Like
Yeah,
it
maybe
was the Skywalker saga, but it wasn't.
maybe it should have just been like Kylo Ren. Started with Anakin as a kid. Maybe we should have started with Kylo as a teenager
Mm-hmm.
and had that story and of the Empire spreading or the Empire's returning basically strikes back again because I
Yeah.
think when I saw the new ones, I was like, how was the Empire this big a threat already? Again, I think that was a big criticism. But if we could have had Teen Kylo and it's like the Jedi's are being reborn and then he kills them
Yeah.
and that's like the climax of that movie, or even the midpoint. Then the second movie, we meet Ray or whatever, whatever, whatever. Haven't thought it all out, but that already feels like they're more tied together, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I do, and like I'm a big fan of The Last Jedi just because of the filmmaking of it. I mean, it's a beautiful film, like beautifully made. And Force Awakens is pretty fun, but also like whatever the central tragic question of that series is, it reboots every movie.
Yeah,
You know,
that's tough.
it's like, the first thing is like the first movie, Force Awakens, is really about like who's Ray, and also like can Finn escape this life? You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And then the second one is something different, more like is Ray going to turn to the dark side? And then the third one is like Ray is a Palpatine, so there's a tragedy there. But they don't really feel
yeah,
like I could see how they would almost be an outgrowth of one another, but they don't feel that way.
yeah. We're kind of too focused on Ray, and we needed just to be on Kylo, who also Adam Driver was the big movie star.
He was a big movie star, and that
And then we don't really know anything about Finn. We don't know enough. I get that he's a stormtrooper and it was rough and they tried to shoehorn things here, but we also needed to see what his life was like. Why,
right.
if the first movie had been Kylo, Ray, and Finn, and them as teenagers and us understanding who they are, how they get to the point
Mm,
that they are, when we join them at Force Awakens, we would have cared. We just would have cared a lot more. And we could see like Ren lose her parents. We could see Finn, whatever the circumstances that lead him to be the stormtrooper, or his treatment while he's a stormtrooper, they struggle. But we kind of jump right into it, and then they're making decisions that we haven't been privy to.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, man. I, as we've talked about before on franchise talk, we are both kind of franchise maximalists. We believe make the movie, and if it's executed good, it'll be good. But like, I'm kind of like, yeah, I want to have seen that intervening trilogy now.
Yeah,
You
me
know what I
too.
mean? Like, we can still get
in
the
the
Ray and
in the
Finn
trilogy, in the trilogy, in the
in
trilogy,
between cool.
in the trilogy, in between.
I'm like, yeah, there's a trilogy somewhere in there about the fall of Kylo that probably would have been pretty good.
Yeah, he starts at like 12 and he's like, that's pod racing. I ain't doing
I
that. Like, but
am
your
done.
grandfather did pod racing. Ah, he breaks. He's like, I don't want to do that. I want to just do the force. Give me the force.
Exactly.
Uh, yeah,
Just tired of Chewbacca.
yeah, that is the through line of the whole movie. Just we come to the end here, but it's the tragedy of his upbringing, then of this love that just takes kind of full control of him as a person.
Yeah.
Then as an adult, we kind of shift to Luke, but the tragedy is still between him and his father. And then Kylo's like the next generation.
Yeah.
And then, Leia's tossed in there. So it could have been, between Leia, and he could have made a decision in like in the Nequels that was like, instead of him like putting a situation I would have put Leia, he could have made a decision that put Leia in a situation where we all knew she was going to die. And then we
Yeah.
would have been like, oh, why did you choose that? Instead of it kind of happening instantly. And like
Yeah.
trying to mirror him and Han on the bridge like Luke and Anakin, I I never dug how that happened, really.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of things that were happening that were there were movie making things but not necessarily storytelling things.
But I get it because it's like you want to pay homage and this is a trilogy and that's the iconic imagery, but it wasn't really it was never about the bridge, it was about the build up and the shock. So of course we're, 7 years later,
For
2020
sure.
hindsight, telling them how, what we think about it now after we've read
Right.
all the criticisms and watched all the
Oh,
YouTube videos and stuff.
and watch the movies a bunch more
Seen
times
the movies a
since.
couple times. Yeah.
You know what I
Hindsight
mean?
is, and it's not even, we don't know that it would have been better. It's just an idea that we're throwing around, but uh, it is interesting to trace that line because we don't really know that much about Han Solo or
Hmm.
Chewbacca. And maybe you don't need to know that much about everybody else besides the Skywalkers. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's Star Wars exists in a really interesting place where it has enough like world building in its universe that it can all kind of exist beneath the surface and like
Yeah.
provide a lot of interesting texture for your main story. Or it also has enough of that that you could dive beneath the surface and explore some of that too. And that's a really tough storytelling like choice to make.
Yeah, I wonder if there could have been the new trilogies with Finn, and then that spins off to like a Finn TV show. Finn handled in a way that,
Mhm.
everybody was happy. We definitely wanted more Finn,
Oh, for
and
sure.
maybe there just wasn't room in the movie in those franchises for his full story. So
And that's I will say that's the one great thing about Star Wars now on TV as a fan, is because they have been able to like go back and say like, let's give this character their show and kind of build that out in a different way.
yeah, yeah. Same with we didn't even talk about Oscar Isaac's character. He was, he
Oh
didn't get
yeah,
his just due either. But yeah, I think that's good, man. I had
yeah,
to
for
come
sure.
up here and download about Star Wars a bit, and I think I will as soon as I make some time. Whatever, I'm gonna definitely watch.
Yeah, for sure. I've been thinking myself about going back for the full rewatch. I definitely need to see the original trilogy. It's been a while for that, and
Been so long.
so long, too long. So, it's I'm not a big completionist, but it might be easy for me to get swept up into a Star Wars marathon. So I won't hate that.
We'll see. All
We'll
right,
see.
cool. Later, man.
Later.